Now our discussion is going to move more to the primary endocrine organs. And we're going to start out with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now the hypothalamus controls a lot of homeostasis. It regulates our thirst, our hunger, our sex drive, our fluid balance, our body temperature, our sleep-wake cycle, and it has an anatomical and a functional relationship with the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus I call the king of the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is the head guard. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. Several of the hypothalamic nuclei and anterior pituitary hormones directly control body functions. Others are what we call tropic hormones, where they control the secretion of hormones from other endocrine glands. They tell the other endocrine glands what to do. Now, there's also something called trophic hormones when we add that H in there. You remember when you studied trophic levels in ecology, and that was the different feeding levels on a food pyramid? Well, trophic hormones induce growth in the target cells. And there are some hormones that are both tropic and trophic. But the hypothalamus functions directly by neurons that terminate in the posterior pituitary. Other functions of the hypothalamus, other hormones from the hypothalamus, target the anterior pituitary. Let me restate that. I don't think I stated it well. Okay. Sometimes neurons from the hypothalamus influence what's going on in the posterior pituitary, but hormones from the anterior pituitary are targeted also by the hypothalamus hormones. I think that's better explanation. Now, anatomically, the hypothalamus is the funnel-shaped part that's anterior and inferior of the diencephalon, and it's connected to the pituitary gland that's outside the brain by a stalk called the infundibulum. And you can see that here. You can see the funnel-shaped hypothalamus right here, and then the infundibulum, and then here's the pituitary gland that sits in that sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. The pituitary gland is a small organ. As we said, it sits in that sella turcica. It's got two parts. It's got an anterior and a posterior. The anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis. Adeno means gland. So this is the hormone secreting part of the pituitary. The posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophysis because it is made of nervous tissue. And they both have totally different functions. But here again, you can see that funnel-shaped hypothalamus. Here's the infundibulum, and then here's your anterior pituitary and your posterior pituitary. This anterior part's the endocrine part, and this is nervous tissue here in the posterior part. Now, there's a specialized blood supply that connects the hypothalamus and the pituitary. It's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. And it allows both the hypothalamus and the pituitary to deliver hormones to the target cells. You've got little capillaries that merge together in the hypothalamus, and these will form large portal veins that will go through that infundibulum. And those portal veins lead to a second capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. any kind of system where you've got capillaries drained by veins and then another set of capillaries, we call that a portal system. So this is the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. Now, as far as the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary go, the posterior pituitary does not make hormones because remember, it's not endocrine. It is nervous. It is hypophysis, okay? So there's two neurohormones made there that are stored and released by the posterior pituitary. And that would be your ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and your oxytocin. So here you can see how this hypothalamic hypophyseal system moves from the hypothalamus through the infundibulum down to the posterior pituitary. Now the antidiuretic hormone that's made there, ADH, it controls water balance because it makes you retain water. Diuresis is urinating, so you want anti-urinating so that you keep more water. And you have low amounts in the hypothalamic neurons, and it moves through to the synaptic vesicles in the posterior pituitary where it gets stored. And so the ADH is released into blood vessels when action potentials tell it to, because it works like nervous tissue, because that's what it is. We're going to have the action potentials tell it to release the ADH. What ADH does, it helps with inserting these channels for water called aquaporins, and we insert those into the plasma membranes of your kidney tubule cells. And so water passes into the cytosol of the cell, back to the extracellular fluid, and back to the blood. And that keeps you from eliminating it as urine. You may have heard that if you have extreme thirst, it could be a sign that you're diabetic. Well, this diabetes insipidus is caused because you have a lack of ADH secretion. And so you have extreme thirst. And your body can't save the water that's consumed. You have a lot of urination. You see where it forms the aquaporins in the kidney tubules. So the water moves from the tubule into the interstitial fluid and then back into the blood so that it's not eliminated. Now oxytocin is the other one. It's produced in the hypothalamus and then it is stored in those posterior pituitary. It functions mainly with reproduction. It targets the mammary glands and the uterus. So it has something to do with contractions during childbirth as well as milk ejection from a mother that's breastfeeding. The milk letdown reflex you may have heard of is a positive feedback loop. The baby suckles and that causes more milk release. When the baby stops suckling, the milk release decreases.